Mush was exhausted. His limbs felt heavy. His throat felt dry. His shoulders were shaking, and above all else his head felt lighter than air, sending his vision into a whirl rather than anything even close to stable. The reason for why Mush felt as if he was about to either sliver away or melt in between the planks of wood that made up the rowboat. Well, maybe it had something to do with the fact he had been rowing the thing for the past 3 days. Although if someone were to ask Mush if he wanted to take a break, he would have yelled to do anything else. Well, he wouldn't yell, he would really just shake his head and mumble incoherently, but the idea of taking any form of rest refused to sit in his mind. Then again, as Mush looked out to his sides and saw only endless ocean on the horizon, the weight that filled his arms seemed to increase. And so he sighed in defeat, letting the paddles rest in their holsters as the boat came to a full stop in the middle of wherever they were, the waves coming to rest after a few moments, coinciding with the same time the boat itself stopped the majority of its swaying. Taking a deep breath through his nose, Mush took in the sights, sounds, and smells around him. The water was a rich navy blue, but Mush found it looked almost purple if he squinted hard enough. The water looking flat, and even the setting sun gently bouncing light off the rarely seen waves. The air let off a gentle breeze, almost whistling in Mush's ears, calming him if only slightly. The smell of salty sea water filled his nostrils, sending a prick down the back of his throat, the mix of pain and discomfort keeping Mush from falling asleep. For a second Mush wondered why he was so against the idea of letting himself relax. Then the reminder kicked open the door to his mind like a SWAT raid. Flinging his eyes back open, Mush looked to his cause of constant stress. Right, he thought to himself as he looked to the other side of the boat where Chime was currently slumped over in a heap. To an ordinary eye it would appear Chime was either sleeping with his eyes open, or he was dead. But Mush knew better. He could tell for an absolute fact that Chime was awake. The reason he was able to tell was the sudden bone-chilling freeze that fell throughout his body whenever he met Chime's eyes, the kind of fear Mush knew Chime was sending on purpose. Forcing himself to keep his eyes opened rather than squeezed shut, Mush sat up straighter, although he still found his arms too heavy to lift. So the silence was pulled onward, growing increasingly awkward for Mush as he no longer had the task of rowing to keep him occupied. Now, without any form of distractions, Mush got lost in his thoughts. A terrible mistake. In truth, Mush had tried to hold his mind back from processing everything. The fear of fully considering it all was like his mind was being turned inside out. Alas, his mind began to whirl, bouncing around from one point to another, accumulating everything that had happened in the past 3 days. Chime's return. The cycle's end. Planning on meeting the others again after all these years. The thought made his queasy. What is it? The sudden voice made Mush flinch, the living flesh in human form looking over to Chime, who shifted slightly. Chime's voice was low and raspy, the end of his question coming out in more of a wheeze as he lazily turned to Mush. What? Was Mush's reply as his eyes slid from point to point, unsure of where to look. Chime sighed, slowly lifting his arm up before planting it against the edge of the boat, each movements making more of his joints pop and crack. Carefully, Chime pushed himself to a full sitting position, cracking his neck and jaw as he did so, each pop seeming to send jolts of relief through his body, even if they seemed to be brief. As Chime turned his head forward, his eyes met Mush's, the single clock hand in each ticking by slowly, as if they were rusted and someone was jumping on them just to get them to move. The glow of his eyes still remained, yet for a few moments it seemed to dim like a candle flickering, yet it was for only a second. Mush felt the weight of the gaze, even if Chime's eyes were hidden behind a curtain of matted hair that went past his face. Chime moved his sleeve under his hair, moving his arm upwards to wipe the corner of his mouth where a light green liquid had began to pool. He threw his arm out to the side, sending the liquid into the water, causing it to bubble, then reset. Mush watched on with bated breath, too nervous to try and repeat himself, and thankfully he didn't have to, as Chime slumped forward again before his voice came out in another rasp. "What are you thinking about?" was Chime's eventual question. Mush paused, taking a minute to think, or rather he was choosing what questions to ask. A couple of questions came from the top of his head. What was the actual plan? Where are we going? Was he really going to stop the others from ripping him to pieces? But those felt too heavy, too sensitive, too much to consider. Then the perfect question settled into Mush's mind, something he had been wondering since he and Chime had left the Pale City, but felt too nervous to ask. But now, with Chime asking, he felt the time was right, and so he looked away while stretching his neck, forcing the words out. Why have those two taken to the maw? Mush let out a stream of air once the question was lifted off his chest as he began to fidget with his palms waiting for Chime's answer, which first came in the form of a long sigh. So that she can get her powers. Chime eventually returned Mush's question with his tone making it clear. He thought the answer was obvious. Mush shook his head, already accepting that part, but other factors to that idea rocked him with inner turmoil. But what if she? Before Mush could continue, Chime tilted his head, and for just a second Mush thought he saw the hints of a smirk tug at the corner of Chime's mouth. However, any chance of getting a better look was blocked by Chime's drape of hair. She won't. Chime voice echoed across the air, and waves. The two words sounded as if spoken hundreds of times in the one instance. Chime's hair parted by just a few centimeters, letting Mush see the light green glow of his eyes while the single clock hand ticked by with increased vigor. After all, Chime pulled his head up slightly, the veil of hair moving back to block his eyes. You can't pluck out her shade this time. And there it was. That single sentence nearly sent Mush spiraling. Regret and remorse flooded his body and mind, but it wasn't only at the memory of what he had done for every cycle, it was the fact he had been so used to it that he had forgotten what she was like before. Whatever look that had crossed Mush's face seemed to make Chime satisfied as he leaned further back with a fulfilled hum. Then the awkward silence came back, which felt suffocating to Mush yet cozy to Chime. It did have to end, of course. They couldn't keep moving if they just sat on a boat in the middle of the ocean now, could they? Sighing in acceptance of needing to at that very least keep the current conversation going, and so Chime turned his head to the side slightly from where he had previously been staring out into the endless horizon of the ocean. We're heading to the wasteland. His voice drolled out, accompanied by the rasp that seemed to be his new normal. Mush blinked his mind, trying to clarify Chime's words as confusion washed into his mind. Said confusion filled Mush's next action as he turned his head back to Chime while narrowing his eyes.
Really?
That's still 3 or 4 days away. Wouldn't it be better for us all to meet up somewhere closer? Mush's voice was unsure and shaky, but still both confused and curious. When Chime turned his head to Mush once more, his shroud of hair kept his face fully hidden, although the blank stare he sent Mush's way could be felt through the air as his voice, while still raspy, came out in a deadpan tone. You think North won't get lost going anywhere else? Mush hesitated before he could speak again. Rather, he rubbed at the back of his neck, mentally yelling at himself for forgetting something like that, although new questions popped into his mind, practically forcing their way out his throat before he could stop himself. But what about the Oth? Before Mush could finish his questions, Chime interrupted him, his voice calm and low. They know. They're on their way now, actually. His voice trailed off as if Chime was in the middle of checking the fact for himself. If Mush was confused before, he was baffled now, but not only at Chime's reassurance but the potential facts that would bleed out from it. Chime held up his arm, even with the apparent effort it took to do so, as Mush found his next words die in his throat as Chime's voice came out in an even greater raspy drawl. Yes, he said while sighing. I've been checking from time to time. Mush tried to speak again, but Chime lightly snapped his fingers to cut him off once more. And yes, he huffed out again. I was able to see what was happening when I was fighting. But it was only in small bits. Snippets, really. Mush felt his brain stall for a second or two, the idea being difficult to comprehend. However, at the very least it saved him having to explain anything. Nevertheless, the idea of Chime knowing anything still sent a shudder of anxiety through his bones. Another silence passed over the two, Mush now holding both the weight and relief of Chime's reveal. Suddenly Chime blinked as he craned his neck to the right, seeming to stare off at nothing, until he gently sighed while a small and gentle smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Mush glanced over to Chime, trying to piece together what gave him that reaction. Before Mush had time to look away, Chime glanced back to him, scanning him up and down before a sharp breath leaked from his nose. Those two have reached that port town, he said simply, his tone filled with both boredom and annoyance at having whatever he saw be ruined by Mush's curiosity. Mush slowly looked to the direction Chime had, mentally visualizing the idea of both of them being there rather than just 6. Before a thought poked at the back of his mind, a voice that echoed through his skull. Do you think he can actually get them there? His voice came out in a gradual crawl, sounding as if he had only picked the next word after he spoke the last one, creating something that felt like reading to a toddler rather than an actual sentence. Chime seemed to chuckle at the thought, though he made no noise. Instead, he dipped his head before shaking it slightly in the manner of reacting to someone saying something utterly stupid. Of course, he said, his voice still holding the slightest bit of amusement. Mush waited for a few more seconds to see if Chime had anything else to say, but when nothing else left his mouth, he found himself in need of another distraction. That's when he realized that, with the time taken for his conversation with Chime, his arms had gone back to normal. It was in that moment that Mush had never been more thankful that he could recover energy quicker than most people. Chime felt his form begin to sway as Mush grabbed the boat's oars once more before he began to paddle away, taking a moment to re-find his rhythm. Chime felt a strange mix of boiling hate and numbness at the general presence of Mush. With everything he had done that was expected, but perhaps with the hope of getting to see the others again, it was evening out. Either way, it felt weird, but he tried not to think on it too much, instead thinking about how exactly Mono and Six would be getting on the maw, or rather who was taking them there. Panic, dread, anxiety. All could be used to describe the feelings of the ferryman, at least at a surface level, but on the inside he had never felt so completely anxious. He stood in a random alley squished between the buildings of a random town where columns of residents march, thought through, all acting like mindless drones as they sauntered their way around, dressed as if part of an upper-class society. Tapping his feet against the somehow sticky and wet pavement, the ferryman felt his mind race. He shoved his hands into random pockets that lined his coat, pulling them out again before he crammed them back in, just trying to do something to keep his mind occupied. It didn't work, rather it only seemed to make things worse, as the ferryman was now focusing on everything around him, listening for any kind of sight or sound that didn't belong. That thought felt weird to think of. After all, how many times had he done this? How many times had he waited in this exact alley for her to arrive, just so he could whisk her away towards that dreaded resort, just to get a few years of peace before she took over? In truth, he didn't know. Sure, he had been keeping count of the number of cycles, but he had never actually noticed when he began this routine. That thought sent a jolt through him, a reminder to how things were different now, how Chime had returned. The ferryman coughed, not to clear his throat, but instead to center himself as he let his hands rest at his side, while he put an end to his feet tapping now. He locked his gaze out the alleyway, scanning the street with laser focus, determined to not ruin this chance. And so the ferryman moved, creeping towards the entrance of the alleyway in order to get a better view. Peering his head out marginally, the ferryman watched for any and all sight of the two children that were now unknowingly freed from the cycle. Once more the ferryman watched as the rows of residents marched through the streets, their bodies fat and plump with sagging skin that looked to almost be melting. The ferryman felt disgusted at the sight. He always had. That was something time could never change, but over the years and cycles he had learned to just push the feeling down. Seconds ticked by and the ferryman felt his patience wear thin. How long did this part take anyways? Frankly, he had no idea at this point. He would turn his brain off and wait for the briefcase to spill. Now, with renewed vigor, the ferryman's eyes glazed over the streets, his neck twisting to watch a section of main road to his right. Stomping along on the sidewalk, just like the rest of its fellow workers, was a standard-looking resident, its gut bursting outwards, pulling the fabric of its clothes to their limit. Its eyes looking just about ready to bulge out from their sockets, while its gaze locked on dead ahead, completely unaware of its surroundings, just like every other monster that was nearby. This observation, however, never crossed the ferryman's mind. No. The first thing that he noticed was how the case of said resident had spilled open, its contents rolling out into the street, utterly ignored by its owner. That was the first cue for the ferryman. The second was the two sets of tiny footsteps that rushed down the middle of the street as they tried not to be crushed by the boots and shoes of the residents. The ferryman moved like a shadow, his bulky frame slipping through the crowd effortlessly, and subconsciously his mind solely focused on the two tiny sets of feet visible through the cracks. The ferryman wasn't really sure when he stepped into the path of the two. All he did know was that it happened. Dropping his head down, the ferryman felt the sight rush into his brain. She was standing right there, dressed in her signature yellow raincoat, and with matted black hair that covered her face stood Six, looking frightened and ready to bolt. That wasn't what caught the ferryman's eyes. He was there. He was standing right in front of the ferryman, holding Six behind him, ready to fight, to protect. Right in front of Six, ready to fight back rather than run, stood Mono. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, at least for the ferryman, as he fully took in the sight that met him. He was really here, truly. He was standing right there, so close that the ferryman could reach out and touch. But then he saw something. It was only for half a second, but sent a sudden idea jolting into his head. It happened as Mono stepped back, his body lowering, and through the eye holes of his paper back flash a dull navy blue light. That flash of light made the ferryman retract his extending hand. Could he use it? Could he control it? If one thing was for sure, the ferryman was not about to risk it. So he kept his hand to his side, his eyes taking in their unsure movements, though they seemed calmed by his lack of any attack, even if it was only by slightly. Suddenly the ferryman shot his head upwards at the sight of movement, or rather the lack of any movement. Craning his head from left to right, the ferryman took in the surrounding residents as they moved to encase the three. Quietly the ferryman cursed under his breath as he tensed his shoulders. How could he be so stupid? Of course these things would be closing in. In all honesty, it had completely slipped his mind by this point. He would just jab out his finger at the girl and carry her off, but it clearly wouldn't work this time if the flashing static light from Mono's eyes was any sign. Thinking quickly, the ferryman squared his shoulder, clenching his fist as tightly as he could manage before he turned his head from right to left, sending a hate-filled glare to every resident that dared to get close. Safe to say, none of the monsters even considered the idea. The sheer presence that the ferryman gave off felt like trying to stand against the wave of a tsunami. Sighing once the residents had backed off, the ferryman turned his attention back to Mono and Six, who still seemed weary yet somewhat more relaxed at how the ferryman had kept the other monsters at bay. Taking a few seconds to think, the ferryman slowly laid out his hand, trying to be as gentle as possible, though he doubted it had much effect. Carefully the ferryman spoke, his voice still holding that gruff low boom, yet was held back to a hush whisper. "It's not safe, we have to go." He moved his hand downwards, slightly heading towards the still cautious Mono and Six, who of course seemed hesitant to the idea, yet they could neither see nor think of any other options. And so the duo stepped onto the ferryman's hand, Mono leading the way while Six looked to be clearly not trusting of the idea, yet Mono seemed to whisper something into her ear which managed to get her on board. Thus the ferryman began to raise his hand, making sure to keep the two children steady, while he used his free hand to try and keep them out of sight from the residents, who were all now staring like an endless sea of cameras, just waiting for the chance to charge. Now walking through the cold but unfortunately alive streets, the ferryman felt his breath slowly solidify in his throat, his eyes constantly moving from one resident to another. The residents themselves weren't the actual problem. The ferryman knew fine well that he could deal with all of them without too much effort. No, the problem was the two children currently standing within his cupped palm. The ferryman was sure he could kill every resident, no doubt about it. However, he was unsure wherever or not he could keep the two children safe while doing so. Therefore he blocked out any plans of confrontation from his mind as he trucked on through the streets, making sure to keep his head low as he ducked and weaved through the alleys to try and lose the trailing monsters that slinked through the shadows behind him. This pattern carried on, though not for long, maybe about 10 to 15 minutes before the ferryman arrived at his location of choice. It was a far more run-down section of the city, a mini-slum in all honesty, yet despite its run-down appearance, it was the only place able to hold the ferryman's rowboat. Moving to said rowboat, the ferryman took one last nervous glance at his surroundings before he uncupped his hands as he set the two children down on the rowboat's edge, with Mono and Six taking the chance to back away from the ferryman, slightly obviously still on guard. Turning his gaze down to the two, the ferryman's mind raced with ideas and plans on how to get them to come along to the maw. At first he considered lying, but he quickly crushed that idea before he could begin. These two were too smart for that. Then a thought hit him, crazy and oh so risky, but potentially the only way he could safely move the two. Swallowing the lump forming in his throat, the ferryman let out a string of loosely put together words, the deep bass of his voice sounding completely out of place to the hush whisper that accompanied the sentence. "Listen, you do not trust me, I can see that clearly. But I can offer you both a place less dangerous than out here." His voice was slow and deliberate, but that only seemed to fuel Mono and Six's suspicions. To the ferryman's surprise, however, Mono stepped forward, gesturing for Six to stay behind him as he moved to face the ferryman, and for the first time in 6,000 cycles the ferryman heard Mono speak. His voice was light and almost squeaky, while filled with fear that Mono was clearly trying his hardest to push down. "Why help us?" he asked, while Six tried to pull him backward away from the ferryman, but Mono stayed put, staring into his melted face. Rubbing the back of his neck, the ferryman tried to rethink his approach, Mono's straightforward question having diced his next few ideas into pieces. Okay, listen, I know of a place that can grant safety, albeit not guaranteed." Mono tilted his head curiously, the idea sounding foreign to not only him but Six, who had now seized her attempts of pulling Mono away, now taking the time to try and paint that kind of picture in her mind. "What kind of place?" Mono managed to ask as he relaxed his shoulders, if only slightly, that fact that the ferryman was yet to attack them being the biggest factor to their loosened demeanors, for it was the first time in, well, forever, that a monster hadn't just outright tried to either grab or kill them. The ferryman also calmed at Mono and Six softened postures while also being more relief at Mono not just flat out rejecting the idea of following him. Therefore he took a deep breath and began to explain. I can take you both to a place called the Maw. I will not lie to either of you, it has a great many of danger, however it has greater benefits. Mono seemed to ponder over the idea, still he seemed to have further questions. That sounds weird, was his short reply. His tone of voice sounded unsure of both the ferryman's words and of his own. That line almost made the ferryman chuckle, but he kept his voice down. Instead he looked towards Six and then to Mono as he tried to explain further. It is anything but in fact it can be considered the most logical place you can ever find. However, there are a few other pieces I need to mention. For one, it is only found out in the sea. Second, it is a maze of pipes and passageways quite easy to get lost in if you do not know of the way. And finally, it is a place that turns you children into food. If the children had began to trust the ferryman before that said trust had just been tossed into a running blender. They backed away, postured, reignited with fear and panic. The ferryman acted quick, shooting himself to a standing position as he held his hands in the air. Wait, wait, wait. I can sneak you both in, I have done it before to many. While his plea seemed to calm the two down slightly, it did little to regain any form of trust. The ferryman slowly lowered his arms, trying to explain again. I understand your fear, but I can assure you that I mean you no harm. I have taken other children there, I can sneak you past the main collection point. I know a few secrets. Mono was the first to step forward again, his left hand lowered to his side while his fingers curled in as if he was holding some kind of ball. The Maw? We saw it on some posters. Why would we want to go there? The question made the ferryman blink before he relaxed his shoulder. Food was his simple answer, which made both Mono and Six pause in surprise and confusion. Mono tilted his head to the side along with Six, who looked to him, then back to the ferryman. There's food? Was Mono's response, which he did so as he looked back to Six, who seemed to perk up at the concept. The ferryman nodded, realizing that he could use this part to get them both to come along, as his nodding became more frantic as he tried to capitalize. That's right, it's a resort, so they keep a great deal of food on them at all times, breads, meats, vegetables, so if you learn to sneak past anything you encounter you could eat your fill. Mono and Six froze, the idea being like a sudden plot twist to a movie. After a few seconds of silence, the two seemed to huddle together, though it was only Mono doing the talking. The ferryman waited with bated breath, shoving his hands back into his pockets while his mind replayed his past words, thinking of what he could have done better. Eventually the duo did end their impromptu team huddle as Mono moved again to face the ferryman, once more his hand still keeping that same ball-holding gesture. Okay. We'll go, was all he said before he and Six slowly moved to sit in the back of the rowboat. The ferryman took a few seconds to process the simple answer, surprised on how easy the whole thing, however it quickly turned into relief and satisfaction as he moved to take a seat in the boat's front. Thus the ferryman quickly took hold of the boat's oars, his fat fingers wrapping around the comparatively thin wood, and he slowly began to push the boat out of its dock. The ferryman carried on with little to no delay, as once he had finally angled the boat correctly, he began to paddle away, taking his time to make sure the boat never swayed to an unneeded degree as to ensure Mono and Six wouldn't panic. It took only another minute before the boat was out in open water, with the ferryman sighing in relief as it did so. He took one last glance at the previously occupied dock, where the same horde of residents could be seen staring through every available vector, their eyes cold and dead, yet the mix of disappointed and anger at being unable to catch any prey was clear. Once again the ferryman felt vile rise in his throat. It didn't take long for the three to get out into fully open water. The boat had always been of high quality, no matter its appearance. Another 20 to 30 minutes passed without a word as Mono and Six sat near the back of the boat in silence, simply staring up at the ferryman as if waiting for any kind of attack. That made the ferryman sigh, although not in annoyance but rather disappointment. I do not intend you any harm. Mono looked into the ferryman's eyes, the holes in the front of his bag showing another flicker of navy blue light as he flinched from the sudden break in silence. Six didn't flinch, however. She did seem to take in the ferryman appearance as a whole, as if she could pick him apart with a gaze, her eyes holding both suspicion and hate from the ferryman, most likely because he appeared as just another monster. Okay, Mono replied simply as he settled back into some form of confident lounging. The kind of confidence no child of nowhere should have. That confirmed it for the ferryman. Mono could use his powers, or at the very least he knew he could use them when danger arose. Another batch of silence hung in the air, with Mono and Six taking momentary glances at each other, silent messages being sent over what might as well have been telepathy. The ferryman watched the duo's mute conversion as a set of memories floated into his mind. Memories of better times. Before the ferryman could be fully locked in his reminiscing, he caught the gaze of Mono, who was staring at him with confusion and redeveloping distrust. It was then the ferryman realized he had been staring at the kid. He leaned his head back, trying to come up with something to say, something that would end whatever conflict before it could start. Then another thought hit him, or rather another memory. The ferryman took a deep breath, trying to prepare himself for an answer as he turned his gaze back to Mono. "Apologies, young one, but I believe it is my first time seeing someone." Wearing a paper bag, he lied smoothly, waiting for Mono's response. Yet no response came, at least at first. Instead, Mono felt around the edges of his bag, taking an extra second to pinch the bottom right corner where a slight tear could be seen. Six also looked to Mono, what small parts of her eyes that could be seen shone with curiosity. Most likely she had been wondering that herself, yet she had never asked. Mono did eventually look back at the ferryman, though the light in his eyes seemed distant, as if he was unsure of his own answer. "It's magic," was all he said, his voice laced with a hint of static. Six blinked before turning her head towards Mono, her hood doing little to hide her confusion. The ferryman, however, smiled. A new silence passed over the three, though this one was much more comfortable, as the boat's paddles gently pushed against the water, leaving a slow, steady rhythm to play in the background, almost like a lullaby. That was until the air began to thicken, a dense fog swiftly replacing the once clear skies. Mono and Six stiffened. The lack of any visibility set off all the alarms in their head. The ferryman, however, hummed in consideration, partially grateful for the wave of fog. He reached under his seat and quickly pulled out a briefcase before clicking open the latches, only somewhat opening the case just enough for the two children to slip through. "Hurry," his voice was hushed and carefully, like any noise would set off an alarm. "You cannot be seen even out here." Mono and Six stepped forward, finally seeing the case through the fog that was only getting thicker and thicker. The duo turned to each other before Mono slowly stepped towards the case, carefully entering before giving a thumbs up to Six, who warily followed. The ferryman placed his free hand over the case and slowly closed the lip. However, he didn't shut. He knew that could set the children off, and so he only kept it from springing open while the two children shuffled inside, staying close to the edge just in case the whole thing proved to be a trap after all. The boat began to slow his once streamlined path, turning into simple sways that somehow kept it moving forward. Then, like a jump scare in a bad horror movie, the boat hit a plate of metal. A plate of metal that was a part of one very, very big slaughterhouse. The ferryman let out a tired sigh, any form of fear never reaching even the edges of his mind. Why should he, after all? How many times had he sat next to this damn resort? How many times had he sat in this exact spot before he snuck in? However many children, how many times had her cold, dead eyes watched his every move? But thinking back to the past few thousand cycles wouldn't do anything good, and so the ferryman shook his head, seemingly to no one, yet he knew she was watching. The sign that the ferryman was now alone came when the cold chill that ran down his spine dissipated as he let out an even greater exhausted sigh. Nevertheless, he pushed down the feeling as he rested his free hand against the bottom hull of the maw, the skin on his palm and fingers shifting to something more akin to a spider in order to allow the ferryman better grip. As he kept pulling along the side of the metal plates, the ferryman glanced downward towards the slightly ajar suitcase where Mono and Six could still be felt jostling about from inside. It took another minute or so, but the ferryman did find what he was looking for, an old-looking hole towards the very bottom of the visible hull. The ferryman stared to the hole, then back to the suitcase as his mind once again took in how things were finally changing. He had honestly given up hope on seeing a day like this. He sighed again, hopefully for the final time, as he lifted the case that held the two children before gently shoving it into the vent of the maw hull, the case taking only a moment to gain speed before it slid down the pipe into the darkness below. Now alone once again, the ferryman didn't waste any time. He grabbed the boat's paddles once again and began to row with increasing vigor, his mind now left with no distractions. It was time, after all these years. Within the depths of the ocean, little could be heard, as all forms of titanic and monstrous aquatic life simply floated about, letting nature run its course in something surprisingly close to normal life, until the stomping came. It shook the ocean floor, the sand getting kicked up into cloud with each step, the nearby life forms all rushing away. Once the sheer presence of the being was felt, it was like the end, the fear of everything just being over in the blink of an eye personified. A set of rock blocked the path for said presence. The being didn't care. With a mere tap, the boulders vanished into nothing, like an image being deleted on a computer. 1 second they were there, the next there wasn't even a speck of dust left behind. And so the being kept walking, her mind screeching with thought after thought, like a platoon of wild beasts all trying to yell over each other. Safe to say the pretender was not in the right state of mind, but could that really be blamed after all? With living through 6,000 cycles, most anyone would go mad. But she kept walking. What little bit of her sanity left was driving her forward, a side effect being that all her thought eventually turned into the same simple phrase. He's alive! He's alive! He's alive! Her mind was the epitome of tunnel vision, so much so she paid no attention to how her body began to be covered in a green glitching energy. Then again, that was expected. It did happen every single cycle. It happened in a flash, but once the energy flickered away, the pretender appeared older, a form she was actually used to rather than the chained version that she was always stuck with at the start of each cycle. But of course she paid it no mind, rather she kept walking her path, never wavering, never even nudging in any other direction. Instead she just kept moving forward, solely locked on making it to the wasteland where she already knew they would be meeting. In the endless hall of mirrors, a titanic figure with smoke for a head was currently rushing forwards, backwards, left and right, the direction of his movement always changing every few seconds. The mirror man cursed under his breath, now deeply regretting the way he had organized this damn dimension. When he had de-iced to lock himself away to make it, so that it would be near impossible to leave that way, he never had to face what was out there, even if something tried to drag him out. But of course now that had come back to bite him. But he didn't stop. He knew it was nearly impossible to escape, but that didn't mean he wouldn't stop trying, and so he ran faster and faster. Yet the endless hall of mirrors seemed to always just be one tick ahead, as the mirrors began to shuffle around in every way possible, as some teleported, some broke apart internally, and some just flat out melted. The mirror man grit his non-existent teeth, hope slowly draining from his soul, until the world seemed to grind to a halt. The mirrors slowed, time itself being pulled to a near stop for everything except the mirror man himself. He paused before a smile formed at the edges of the smoke as the mirror man chuckled quietly, always one to lend a helping hand. His voice seemed to bounce around the air, as if in an echo chamber. However, he paid it no mind as he dashed forward to the now perfectly still mirrors. In a flash, the mirror man crashed against the mirror, the glass seeming to glow briefly before the mirror man was pulled inside. He landed with a thump, his gigantic form tumbling against the equally gigantic ground. He blinked, regaining his bearings, before he looked around to find himself in what looked to be just a random grass plain. The mirror man let his hands grab a few strands of grass, taking a minute to feel the wet blades in his palm, his broken mind seeming to calm, if only for a moment. Safe to say it didn't last long, as the mirror bolted upright, his body regaining his usual twitch as his mind raced with ways to figure out where he was, and more importantly how to find out what direction the wasteland was in. In the wasteland, high in the sky stood, or rather floated, the north wind. The living element was still almost frozen, a complete contrast to its usual manic energy. He floated about haphazardly, his mind at a complete loss, what little amount of thoughts he had, all saying the exact same thing. This is real. This is real. The north wind did begin to move again, and when he did, it came with a bang. His form loosened, his humanoid silhouette turning into something more akin to a hawk or crow as he dashed from one point to another, his form writhing with pure glee. He's back! He's back! He's back! The north wind cheered like a child getting a mountain of toys for Christmas, though to be fair, something like that completely paled in comparison to what the north wind was feeling. For a second, the north wind readied himself to zoom away to find Chime himself, for his patience was practically non-existent. However, then he stopped before he curled in on himself and began to laugh. He could feel it, the way that glitching energy seemed to bend the air around it. To the north wind it felt like a static shock, but he didn't care. Instead, what the north wind was laughing at was the way the shock seemed to send a message, though not with words but rather with intent. Stay there, we're all coming to you. It made the north wind laugh harder, the way Chime just knew that he would get lost only further cemented that he was really him. The north wind's laughter died down, his form retaking its humanoid appearance as he simply leaned back while still in the sky, as if laying down in a hammock. He couldn't believe it, yet he could accept nothing else. This was real, it was really happening, everything and everyone was coming back, at last. A plan that was 240,000 years in the making could finally be completed.